If you're trying to remember a phone number, just the 7-digit one, what do you do when you're remembering the phone number? You say it over and over again, right? Or if you don't say it, you think it over and over again. And if someone distracts you, then you lose it. That's working memory, roughly speaking. And your working memory capacity, so imagine you could do 4 digits and remember them. You could do 6, you could do 8, you could do 12. Likely not. 12 is really pushing it. That's a great estimator of IQ, working memory. In fact, there's almost no... Neuropsychologists like to think that working memory is something in and of itself, but that's because they don't know a damn thing about psychometrics, generally speaking. There's almost no difference between fluid intelligence and working memory. And the reason for that is that all measures of intellectual function collapse into G. And so we can take a look at what that means. This is from this character here, Carroll, John Carroll. If you want to know everything there is to know about IQ, this is a book that everyone who's a psychologist you shouldn't be able to be a psychologist unless you've read this book, in my estimation. There's a couple of key texts, and this is one of them. This guy Carroll wrote this thick book. You don't have to read the whole thing because a lot of it's just, in some sense, demonstrations and proof of what he's saying. But what he did for IQ is the same thing that psychometricians did for the big 5. You've got the big 2 at the top. They're not very highly correlated. I think it's about 0.2, something like that. So they're pretty independent. And then they fragment into the big 5, and then you can differentiate them further into the big 10. And there really are 5 different traits because they're only correlated with each other at about 0.2 to 0.3. So they're really quite distinct. The question is, if you fractionate IQ, how correlated are the things that you fractionated into? And the answer to that is 0.8 or 0.9. There's one factor in IQ, roughly speaking. If you take, imagine that you took an IQ test and you took, it was 100 items long, and you took the 50 items that were the most correlated with each other, and then the 50 items that were the least correlated with those 50 items. So you broke it into 2 as much as you could. You maximally differentiated it. You might ask, well, how correlated would the scores be on those 2 different subsets? And the answer would be like 0.9. Because there isn't 2 things that you're measuring. Even if you break it up that way post hoc and say, well, it's unfair, but we're going to say because these are the 50 most highly correlated and these are the leftovers, like we're really capitalizing on chance there, you're still going to get an almost identical readout from both sections of the IQ test. And it's just not the same with personality. So this is Carroll's model, basically. Stratum 3, that's the highest level of abstraction. That's fluid intelligence. And then you can break it down into these subcategories of cognitive ability. And you might say, well, how different are those subcategories? And the answer is not very. If you're high in one, you're very likely to be high in all of them. Now, there's a bit of a coda to that, which is that the lower your IQ, the higher the correlation between these sub-aspects of intelligence. The lower your IQ, the higher the correlation between the sub-aspects of intelligence. As you get up into the higher strata of IQ, your intelligence differentiates more across the potential range of differentiation. Which is to say, there's one way of not being very bright, but there's multiple ways of being bright. So, but even so, if you're high on one, you're still quite likely to be high on the rest of them. So then the question is, what's the correlation between G and each of these sub-elements of G? And then what's the correlation between the sub-elements of G themselves? So if this was plasticity, and we were looking at openness and extroversion, the correlation here would be about I think it's about 0.5, something like that. And the correlation between openness and extroversion would be about 0.3, quite a bit of difference. But with this, there's G, there's the sub-elements, there's the correlation coefficients, 0.9, almost 0.95, what is that, 6 or 8? 8, 0.8, 0.6, 0.8, 0.8, 0.9, pretty much, 0.9, pretty much. Well, you can fractionate it the best you possibly can. It doesn't matter. It's one thing. It's one thing. And it looks like it's the ability to abstractly represent and then to manipulate the abstractions. I said with working memory, you can get it that simply. How many digits can you keep in your head simultaneously without dropping one? That's it. God. It's unbelievable. It's pretty straightforward. And then it's this viciously powerful predictor of long-term life success, probably a prediction of around 0.5. Now, psychologists hate this. They won't admit that it exists.